The trucks started showing up before sunrise. Same route, same noise, same cloud of sawdust drifting across the fence line every morning. At first, he thought it was temporary, a few weeks maybe, just the lumber factory clearing excess scraps while they expanded operations down the road. But the piles kept growing. Broken pallets, warped boards, cut off hardwood pieces, twisted beams with nail holes still buried inside them. Most of it dumped right against the back fence of his property like the land was some kind of unofficial landfill nobody cared about. He complained twice during the first year. The factory manager barely looked up from his paperwork, said disposal costs were expensive, said the scraps weren't hurting anything, then finally added something that stayed with him for years afterward. "You should be thanking us. We're saving you firewood money." The men in the office laughed when he left. After that, he stopped complaining, which the factory took as surrender. The dumping continued for 11 straight years. Entire truckloads sometimes. Enough waste wood to bury sections of the fence line by winter. Neighbors felt bad for him. Some told him to sue. Others said he should just sell the property and move farther outside town before the factory expanded even more. But every evening, after the trucks finished dumping, he walked the piles alone, sorting boards, pulling nails, stacking hardwood separately beneath a long shed behind his barn. Oak, walnut, maple, cherry. Would the factory considered too damaged, too uneven, or too small to matter anymore? And slowly, without anybody realizing it, the piles beside his fence stopped becoming garbage. They became inventory. The factory didn't notice at first. Why would they? To them, he was just the quiet old man living beside the dump road. But 11 years after the first truck arrived, the company executives drove past his property one morning and saw something standing where the scrap piles used to be, a fully operating custom furniture mill. And parked outside the loading dock were trucks waiting to haul handcrafted hardwood furniture built from the same worthless wood they had been throwing away for over a decade. His name was Walter Greene, 63 years old when the dumping started. He'd spent most of his life repairing farm equipment, welding broken gates, and fixing machinery other people threw away too early. That was part of why the scrap piles bothered him differently than they bothered everyone else. Most people saw garbage. Walter saw material. Not immediately. At first, even he thought most of it was useless. Water-damaged boards, crooked cuts, hardwood scraps too short for commercial production. But every now and then, he'd find something buried in the piles that made him stop. Solid walnut, old-growth oak, maple dense enough to outlast generations if somebody took the time to work with it properly. And once he started noticing those pieces, he couldn't stop looking for them. So every evening after work, he sorted the good wood beneath one shed, the best wood beneath another. He bought old woodworking books at estate sales, watched cabinet makers online late at night, spent months rebuilding a broken planer someone abandoned behind a machine shop 2 counties over. Slowly, the old barn behind his house began changing. Workbenches appeared first, then sanding stations, then shelving units stacked floor to ceiling with carefully sorted hardwood the factory never realized they'd thrown away. The irony of it stayed almost funny to Walter. The factory spent thousands every month disposing of wood craftsmen would have paid good money for, because modern production only cared about speed and uniformity. Anything imperfect became waste. But Walter understood something factories forgot long ago. Real craftsmanship begins where mass production gives up. The first table he built took him nearly 3 months. Not because he didn't know how, because he refused to rush it. Hand-finished walnut, mortise and tenon joints. No veneers, no shortcuts. When he finally sold it, the buyer drove nearly 4 hours to pick it up. Then came another order, then another after that. And quietly, without advertising much at all, people started hearing about the old man building custom hardwood furniture beside the lumber factory. The same factory still dumping scrap wood at his fence every morning. What nobody there understood yet was that Walter had spent 11 years learning how to turn their waste into something more valuable than the products they were mass-producing inside the plant itself. By the 5th year, Walter's barn no longer looked like a hobby workshop. The shelves were organized by species and grain pattern. Stacks of reclaimed walnut sat drying beside carefully labeled maple boards, salvaged from factory offcuts, most workers never even looked at before throwing away. And every section of the workshop had been built from the scraps themselves. Workbench tops, storage racks, cabinets, even the flooring beneath the larger saws came from reclaimed hardwood. The factory still never paid attention to any of it. Why would they? From the road, Walter's property still looked modest. An old barn, a weathered house, a quiet man working alone. Meanwhile, the lumber company kept expanding. Bigger contracts, faster production lines, more waste, and every year. That was the strange part. The more successful the factory became, the more valuable material they threw away. Especially after automated cutting systems were installed. Perfect boards mattered. Anything with unusual grain patterns, knots, slight warping, or inconsistent cuts got discarded immediately because slowing production cost more than wasting wood. But those imperfections became Walter's advantage, because handcrafted furniture doesn't reward sameness the way. The first major breakthrough came when a restaurant owner from the city ordered 12 custom dining tables after seeing one of Walter's pieces at a farmhouse outside town. Then a hotel placed an order. Then a designer from 3 states away contacted him asking if he could source more reclaimed walnut with natural grain variation. Walter laughed when he read that message. Source more. He had mountains of it sitting behind the fence every week. But the factory still didn't understand what was happening beside them. Even when delivery trucks started arriving at Walter's barn, even when workers from the mill occasionally wandered over during lunch breaks to ask about, management never cared enough to look closely. To them, Walter was still just the old man collecting scrap wood because he didn't know any better. And that misunderstanding kept making him stronger, because while the factory focused on producing more volume, Walter spent those same years quietly building something far harder to manufacture. The factory noticed the trucks first. Not Walter's trucks, customer trucks, delivery vans pulling into the old barn at all hours of the week. At first, management assumed he was reselling salvage wood, maybe running some small side business cleaning. Nobody thought much about it until one of the company's sales managers walked into a hotel lobby nearly 80 miles away and froze in front of the reception desk. The entire lobby had been furnished with Walter's work. Massive black walnut tables, handcrafted benches, custom shelving built from reclaimed hardwood with grain patterns so striking they almost looked painted. A small brass plate near the reception desk read, Greene. The sales manager recognized the wood immediately because he'd watched versions of those same walnut slabs get tossed into scrap bins behind the factory for years. When he returned, he told the executives what he'd seen. Most of them laughed. At first, restaurants ordering custom, reclaimed furniture, interior designers specifically requesting Greene Millworks products, photos online showing handcrafted pieces, selling for prices far above what the factory charged for mass-produced commercial furniture. That was the moment curiosity turned into panic, because the executives finally understood something deeply uncomfortable. Walter wasn't scavenging trash anymore. He was competing with them. And worse, people were willing to pay more for what he built. One executive finally drove out to Walter's property himself, the same man who joked years earlier about free firewood. He barely recognized the place. The old barn had expanded into a full workshop. Kiln drying sheds stood near the loading area. Finished furniture filled the showroom beside the mill. And stacked beneath covered storage racks was enough reclaimed hardwood inventory to supply production for years. All from the scrap piles the factory had dumped behind Walter's fence. The executive walked through the workshop slowly, running his hand across a finished walnut table polished smooth as glass. Then finally asked the question nobody at the factory wanted answered. How much of this came from our scrap wood? Walter looked around the mill quietly for a moment, then answered honestly, most of it. The executive swallowed hard, because in that moment, he realized the factory had accidentally spent 11 years supplying the man who had just built. By the 10th year, Greene Millworks had a waiting list. Not for months, for nearly a full year. People traveled from across the state to place custom orders. Restaurants wanted reclaimed hardwood interiors. Hotels wanted handcrafted lobby furniture. Even luxury home builders started requesting Walter's work specifically. That was the advantage the factory could never duplicate. Walter wasn't producing furniture from perfect uniform boards. He was building from wood with history already inside it. Natural grain shifts, old growth density, weather marks, irregular patterns. Mass production systems were designed to eliminate. The factory executives hated that part most of all, because every successful piece Walter sold reminded them of something deeply embarrassing. They had thrown that wood away. For years, entire truckloads of it. At one point, the company even attempted to quietly change its disposal policy after realizing how much reclaimed hardwood Walter still had stacked beneath the mill sheds. Walter's inventory was enormous. 11 years of carefully sorted hardwood, protected beneath drying sheds and climate-controlled storage. Enough material to sustain production for years, without needing another board from the factory at all. That realization hit hardest during the Regional Woodworking Expo 2 counties over. For the first time, Greene Millworks displayed alongside large commercial manufacturers, including the factory itself. Their booth looked polished, corporate banners, mass-produced showroom furniture. Walter's section looked simple by comparison, just a few handcrafted walnut tables beneath a plain wooden sign. But by midday, the crowd around Walter's booth was so large it blocked the aisle. People ran their hands across the grain patterns, asked where the wood came from, took photos beside pieces selling for prices the factory couldn't understand. And sometime late that afternoon, one of the executives stood quietly at the edge of the crowd watching customers ignore the factory showroom almost entirely, while lining up to place orders with Walter instead. The same old man they once laughed at for collecting free firewood. That was the moment they finally understood the real difference between what Walter built and what they built. The factory produced products. Walter produced craftsmanship. And craftsmanship becomes more valuable. After that, the truck stopped dumping wood beside Walter's fence. The factory found new disposal contracts almost immediately once they realized what the scraps had actually been worth. But by then, Walter no longer needed them. Greene Millworks had become fully self-sustaining. The old barn expanded again. New apprentices started working beside him. And for the first time in years, the property behind the fence looked quiet. No mountains of discarded lumber. No clouds of sawdust drifting across the fields every morning. Just stacks of carefully finished hardwood waiting for delivery. And strangely enough, Walter never seemed angry about any of it. Not even toward the factory, because somewhere along the way, the scrap piles stopped feeling like humiliation. They became opportunity. That was the part people talked about most afterward. Not how much money Walter made, not how badly the factory underestimated him, but how patiently he kept building something valuable while everyone else saw nothing worth saving. Years later, customers still visited Greene Millworks to hear the story for themselves. And Walter would sometimes walk them behind the workshop, toward the old fence line, where the first scrap piles once sat buried beneath weeds and mud. Then he'd smile quietly and say the same thing every time. Most people throw things away too fast. He wasn't just talking about wood. And standing there beside the mill, surrounded by furniture built from material other people discarded for over a decade. It became obvious why Walter succeeded when the factory never saw him coming. He understood something factories forgot long ago. Waste is often just value nobody has been patient enough to recognize yet.